Welcome everyone, I'm Elaine Holtham from Aroga Technologies, and I have beside me Russell Cross from PRC. And today we wanted to discuss AT and beer. You'll notice that we've sort of been at this for a while because my beer is a little on the low side, but anyways, cheers.
In fact, you know, this is really, thank you for inviting me. Actually, having the beer instead of doing the presentation is really a good idea. In fact, it was supposed to be a 5-hour presentation, so those of you watching on YouTube may want to turn off now, but if you don't want to turn off now, good news is I'm going to make it maybe about 15 minutes and that's it. Depending on how quick you drink the beer as well.
There we go. So the session was called Vocabulary is More Than Words, and I'm going to put it off to Russell so he can sort of give us a little bit more about what that presentation was all about.
This is really just a brief look at the way in which the use of core vocabulary for developing AAC systems has come about over the past maybe 50, 60 years really. And I'm going to go through some of the key papers that I think have moved us from there to where we are now. I'm going to start here by going right back to 1960. And this is a paper by Mine and O'Connor, which is called A Study of the Oral Vocabularies of Severely Subnormal Patients. And I'm leaving in what would be the less charitable way of expressing ourselves here.
I guess in 1960 they weren't as politically correct
absolutely
as
the case, yeah.
Now. Yes.
So what these guys do here were to look at the vocabulary of folks who had severe cognitive impairments. And they collected data, and they collected a list of over 2,500 different words. And the key quote that they have in their article is as follows, quote, "It is hoped that the list of words which occur frequently in the vocabulary of the subnormal will be of value to those who educate and train these patients." And the key thing to take away from that is that although they don't use the word core vocabulary, they do in fact say using the list of the items that are most frequently occurring in order to train and educate. So this is maybe one of those very early references to the use of having a somewhat of a core vocabulary that we can have to educate our clients. If we then look at a few years later in 1968, Berger has a paper called The Most Common Words Used in Conversations. This is from the Journal of Communication Disorders. And we're looking here at now collecting a sample of over 25,000 words. And similar to the Mine and O'Connor, we've also got here like 2,500 different words. But what this study was really looking at was trying to use the spoken vocabulary very specifically, or with the intent of using that to develop vocabularies that illustrated common vocabulary and high frequency stuff. But then in 1984, I think, is when we probably see the first of the AAC specific papers, which is from Buchelman et al. In 1984, and it's called The Frequency of Word Occurrence in Communication Samples Produced by Adult Communication Aid Users. And this is also a very good example of what I think is the first time that client-generated data was actually used, because these folks who were providing the input are using Canon communicators. And for those who remember the Canon communicator, yeah, it was a small box with a keyboard on it and actually printed out what you wrote on a piece of ticker tape.
Yes, it's a little tiny strip of paper, not bigger than a little label.
That's right, and you would collect this ticker tape and hang it up in your clinic, and it would be there. But what Buchelman and the folks were doing here was collecting that because it was client generated, and then on the basis of that they were able to measure the frequency of use of words there. And this is also therefore the precursor to the modern equivalent, which is data logging facilities within the devices. So to me this is a worthwhile paper to mention, simply because of the fact that it's very specifically towards AAC and that it's using the automated data analysis.
Interesting, though, that paper would be literate adults because the Canon communicator was a typing type of machine.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And I think what you'll see in all of these papers is that each one takes you a step closer to something else. Each one misses other things.
right.
So you see that evolution from one place to another when people clearly have said things to you like, well, that's okay, but this is adults. What can we do next?
Right.
Which is why we then look in 1992, we see a good example of a paper there from Fridokin and Moore called The Initial Vocabulary for Non-Speaking Preschool Children Based on Developmental and Environmental Language Sources. So now we're starting to focus on different population, i.e. the kids. But this is also an example of not just collecting data and building frequencies, but then recommending a list to then use in order to intervene. So we're now looking at this next step of saying, here's your core vocabulary list, and here's what we think you should take a look at teaching.
Right.
So this is moving us ever closer to this, to where we are now with the with lots of different lists.
But it's interesting, and I don't know if anybody's noting as you're seeing the slides that Russell is producing or has put up on this presentation. Here, most of the word samples are 20,000 plus words, and yet when you look at how many different words come up, they're within the 1,500 to 2,000 range.
Absolutely, and that brings us really onto our next paper, which I think is worth looking at, and that's by Balandin and Iacono, and this is from 1999. Okay. And this is the wonderful title of Crews, Wusses and Whoppers, Core and Fringe Vocabularies of Australian Meal Break Conversations in the Workplace. And this is from the AAC Journal, but the folks here actually looked at the vocabulary being used by regular speaking people, but in the workplace during a meal break. And this is the equivalent of saying, what vocabulary do you think we'll need if we go to McDonald's?
Right.
But what you see is that the vocabulary there that's being used does not consist of hundreds of different food type words. And although food is a topic that gets discussed, many other things get discussed, and when you look at the core vocabulary, it starts to look like every other core vocabulary. The words and want and some and many and all these things that are starting to come in. So this is one that also serves to confirm that idea that core vocabulary is common across groups. And even if you look at a very specific topic of during meal break, you find that they are using the same core vocabulary.
Well, it's interesting. I'm even just thinking about how we talk. If we went into McDonald's or another restaurant, the first words we use would be I would like, I want, and there might be some food-related words after that. But once we've got our food, really, what would we talk about except for it is good, that tastes great, those sorts of things. When you actually think about what you're saying, and I think a lot of us don't actually analyze what we're saying when we talk, that it is interesting to see how many of the core kind of words come up. It's
an interesting exercise if people haven't done this for a while. Next time you go out with a group of friends, sit back just for 5 minutes and don't take part in the conversation. So just sit back and listen to what people are saying. And it is incredibly surprising that you will find that there are those words that are very, very common. And if it's while you're at the pub, for example, a lot of that conversation has nothing to do with the thing that's in front of you. It's to do with what's happening, who's doing what, where, why, how, and it's much more social. It may be work related, who knows. But literally, to give yourself 5 minutes, don't talk, listen, and you'll see that the core is a real phenomenon.
Right.